Hello, in this video I want to continue the conversation that we've been having about racial capitalism and space privatization. I think that this is a really important conversation because I think it allows us to really reconceptualize like what we kind of are defining the topic as, and I think that this is really important to consider when you're thinking about a space resolution, because I feel like when people kind of like walk into these resolutions, they really overlimit themselves to like what types of critiques of the resolution and ways of generating imagination out of the resolution they can really access. And so I think that I'm really happy to be able to like do a series that allows me to really start with what I think is like a core criticism in terms of how you're kind of thinking about the development of like various debates that have been had on other resolutions that are now being taken to the space resolution. And that's why we're kind of like doing this whole series on racial capitalism and space privatization. Hopefully, if you haven't already, you're going to go back and watch the intro to racial capitalism and space, or the last video that I just did that was the racial capitalism and space privatization portion that started the question about like how racial capitalism works in the affirmative, because I definitely think all of that stuff is really important background information to figure out where you're kind of like coming into the conversation that we're having in this video, because they kind of like follow along being able to build a conversation about the way in which this critique kind of like fits in different facets and different argumentations in debate. And specifically in the last video, we did a lot kind of covering like what are the most important arguments or like possible ways to form a critique of racial capitalism for this resolution in the context of like an argument about Whitey on the moon, and the way in which that can relate to questions of like how you relate to like the case arguments that are seen the most against these types of affirmatives, and the framework and T concerns that are usually shown the most. And in this video, I want to continue by talking about the ways in which this affects debates against criticisms and debates against counterplans and disads, because I definitely think that those are really important places for like this criticism to consider where you're kind of spending your time prepping, because I think that particularly in the context of criticisms, there are like a lot of arguments to be made about how Whitey on the moon is particularly over responsive and over not idealistic, but over values the kind of like centering of whiteness that it does in the context of its analysis. I feel like there are a lot of arguments in terms of like how Whitey on the moon specifically in debate operates as a particular reactionary mode to the resolution that doesn't actually create the space for a generative imagination of how we use space outside of the terms of like how white dreams have already taken over it. I feel like a lot of the arguments that can be really made are about like why it's over focused on white supremacy, especially in the context of like various types of like other structural criticisms, whether it be settler colonialism, whether it be Afro-pessimism, or just like a different form of the K, all can take like problems with the way in which the specific story of the Whitey on the moon has an overfocus on like the mythology of whiteness, and thus makes it kind of like hard to think about ways in which we can create resistance outside our reactionary relationship to whiteness itself, which makes it harder to think about like the generative capacity of what the affirmative does outside of the terms of just being able to like when that it critiques and refuses the kind of terms that the resolution is on, which I feel like leans itself into also more different like academy cases and stuff like that. And so I feel like when you're building your response to the criticism, you really need to figure out like what burden of solvency you want the 1AC to have, and I feel like you really need good arguments about why the criticism of like, for instance, white space projects and their relationship to the kind of production of like urbanization and things like that are not only at the root of various forms of like spatialized violence that exist, not only in the context of this resolution, but in impacts broadly, but also you have a lot of arguments to make about the way in which you have a lot of arguments to make about like why the types of criticisms that are being made allow for a particular creation or generation of energy to other types of like organizing resources and programs that are particularly important. I feel like there's like a lot of arguments to draw here in terms of like where like the energy of like Black people's organizing have to go in the 60s in relationship to like the way in which like Cold War logics allowed the production of a particular mythology of the space race that kind of erased the way in which Black people were struggling. It allows you to make a specific historical conjecture about like why there is like a specific necessity to kind of like choose where we're putting our values, and why over investing into like space as this place that we should kind of like be able to occupy doesn't like allow us to like consider like the various types of like unethical relationships in space that exist determined by our kind of like unethical relationship to the world that we're currently occupying, right? And so I feel like making arguments about like how this generates kind of like movement elsewhere is like a really important part of how you're able to make your strategy as a whole, but requires you to really have a really strong kind of like framing argument that like gives the judge a reason why those types of values and methodology is particularly important. I then think that when you're trying to move on to like how you're able to access questions like the permutation, you need to make arguments about like why your refusal of like the white kind of like mythologic like occupation of like space is not the same as your refusal of like any freedom dream related to space, and why there can still be an existence of the way in which Black people are able to like think about futuristic visions of themselves in space or relationship to those things. But the particular way that that they're kind of like guiding the question of the resolution makes it like a lot harder in order to like think about like the terms of for like how you're able to separate those two things, and thus like risk the ability of those kind of like freedom dreams to be like commodified by sources of whiteness, to be commodified by the private sphere and visions of like black capitalism that are like often used in various like visions of Afrofuturism that the AF isn't responsible for, but the AF is also not outside of those systems, and thus there's a consideration for what those not the AF, the alternative is not outside of those systems. So there is a consideration to be made about like what role it particularly serves in relationship to being able to overcome some of the things that the affirmative is really pointing out are key kind of barriers. And so I think that when you're then trying to transfer over to how you're really answering the counterplans and dis has to be, I feel like a lot of this stuff is really how you're able to just be like, the question of space exploration is like not an inevitable one, and the idea that we have to do it in order to like create and save humanity from these threats is a like source of vitality that is like bad. I feel like just straight up impact turning, a lot of the impact framing that a lot of teams will kind of be offering in the counterplan dis page, is like really important for you to get to the nitty gritty portion of the debate, because I feel like a lot of the arguments that they're going to make is like not whether or not utilitarianism is good or bad, but rather whether or not these kind of like not random, but things that we are kind of like already know are coming, such as like space debris, like fallout, etc., are things that we should like just protect people from or not, and why they kind of like impact places that have the least amount of like disaster infrastructure and stuff like that. And so I feel like in order for you to like win that debate, you really need to like impact the call to vitality and the idea that humanity is something worth saving in the first place, because of the way in which it kind of like further sanitizes like how we're able to sacrifice that call for us to save like all human value from being able to like actually like tune ourselves into like very like intimate like smaller forms or like smaller scale forms of violence that we like are often able to like push out into the perimeter, and that often create the like situation of like financial extraction and urbanization that is kind of like the core of the criticism that you're making. And so I think being able to connect that impact framing to a lot of the core kind of arguments you're making in the 1AC is like super important to allow the judge to kind of understand the continuity between these arguments, and to really kind of like prefer the way in which you're asking them to evaluate like what types of things in the debate matter, because there are still like alternative ways in which you can win, that energy that's being pushed toward other movements can create different types of infrastructure that are necessary to survive forms of crises, and like what it means to like actually like be able to come together and create forms of community and mutual aid in the scene of the apocalypse, etc., which are all I think are really interesting ways to think about like how you can actually relate to this resolution, which hopefully I'll be able to get into more on in other videos. But yeah, thank you as always for watching.